About 80 years ago, two businessmen bought an old farm and adjoining property in the town of Norfolk, Connecticut. They called their large holding Great Mountain Forest. Today, it is a dense wooded area of 6,500 acres, which serves, among other things, as a base for the forestry schools of the University of Connecticut and Yale. But it wasn't always like that. Edward C. Childs, who inherited the forest from his father and has spent much of his life studying and preserving its natural resources, told me what it was like in his youth.
I was 4 years old when I spent my first few months here, and that was in 1909. As I remember it was pretty well devastated, much of it, and largely grown to blueberries, and you could go out and pick hundreds of quarts of blueberries, where the bushes had grown up in place of trees in the forest which were devastated. And sitting on a pony, I could look over the top of practically all of the forest and see these low, rugged ridges with a lot of dead trees, like hairs on an old man's chin, standing up, burned hemlock and things like that that had been killed by fire. And there was very little timber.
Northwestern Connecticut was once the center of the American iron industry, and the last vestiges of that industry were still operating in the early 20th century.
Practically the entire forest was owned by two very large mining companies. One was the Barnum Richardson mining company, which the name Barnum was, you find today, the Barnum Bailey Circus, and centered in Bridgeport. And the other was the Hunts Lyman Iron Company, and there's a little town still called Huntsville down south of us, where there was a foundry, rather large foundry. And the Barnum Richardson Iron Company smelted all of their ore down in Allendale, or East Canaan. And I used to ride my bicycle down there and see them pour the pig iron back in the early days, my early days anyway. But they didn't have any fuel, any coal. And so they did what they did frequently in Europe in similar situations. They used charcoal. But the early years here, there were always forest fires, near or far away, and the smoke would be gray and the ashes would fall all over the house from fires on Canaan Mountain to the west, or go across the valley in the Taconics.
The area had none of the rich wildlife for which it is noted today.
Deer, for instance, didn't exist in Connecticut. And for years, if any deer were found straying in the state, they'd be sent up here because they had put a very high fence, an 18-foot fence around 40 acres in order to protect deer and to keep them from straying. And gradually the deer population began to build back, and of course it's been very successful. First introduction of turkeys was done on this property, I think largely because surrounding us there are large tracts of timberland, and concomitant with that the wildlife that you find in a forested area.
Conservationism was a growing movement among Americans of wealth at the turn of the century, and the owners of Great Mountain Forest were among its early supporters in Connecticut.
I think that preservation was something that grew because of the need for it, but I think when they originally came here they had other ideas, that it was going to be developed for perhaps as a summer colony, something of that sort, and then they became more interested in just keeping it as a wild area and bringing back both animals and fowl. The duck increased rapidly. I know they sent up, in the early days, they sent out a collector into the northern plains of the United States and adjacent Canadian provinces, and I can't think of his name now, but he brought back all kinds of eggs which were hatched under silkies, sort of a Chinese hen, who were very attentive to the young chicks or the young ducklings. And all kinds of birds were raised here, canvasback and and gadwall or gray duck, and they also had some cranes and things of that sort. But that was all given up during the war, during the First World War. It was too expensive to maintain that type of thing. But by that time, the deer had returned, and the wildlife was beginning to build up. It's very exciting. And then the first turkeys were released on this property. And this morning, just going down to Torrington on a back road here, we saw 15 birds, 15 turkeys, old ones and the scads of young ones, all able to fly and more than half grown. It was quite a sight.
Part of the significance of Great Mountain Forest lies in the fact that it includes some of the very few first-growth woods in Connecticut.
There are areas of definite climax forest, and we're trying to maintain those small areas because that goes back to areas which have not been affected by, may have been affected by Indians, but not affected by white man. It goes back before the area was taken over by man. But there are not many of those. They're patchy, and hopefully they will be maintained as such, because I think the forest is large enough to keep at least some of those old areas undespoiled.
But Great Mountain Forest, it seems to me, has another significance as well. Much of the world's increasing environmental concern is rightly focused on protecting areas that are ecologically threatened. But of late there has been a growing interest in trying to restore natural environments that have already been destroyed. Experiments with reforestation, in fact, are underway in many areas. The return of Great Mountain Forest from devastated wasteland to glorious woodland should give us faith that such efforts are not necessarily in vain.